Humiliation only works when everyone else stays seated. The tray struck the metal floor with a hollow clang that echoed through the Interstellar Cultural Academy cafeteria, a room built of brushed steel and pale composite panels that reflected light like a hospital corridor. Steam from reheated protein stew curled upward in thin ribbons before fading into the hum of the overhead ventilation. At the center of a loose circle of students, Lyra Vaith knelt without trembling, her silver-blue skin catching the fluorescent glow, her long pale hair falling forward as she stared at the spilled food inches from her hands. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and synthetic spices. Someone laughed. Someone else muttered, "Go on." A phone hovered, recording. No one moved to stop it. Lyra lowered her gaze not in surrender, but in calculation. She had memorized the room dimensions on her first day, 40 feet across, 20-foot ceiling, 3 exits, 2 cameras above the serving line. She knew exactly who was watching. What she did not know was who would choose to act. At the far end of the cafeteria, Ethan Cole wiped grease from his fingers with a shop rag, the tang of coolant still clinging to his sleeves. 6'2", broad-shouldered, white, with the steady posture of someone who had worn a uniform for too many years, he had come in for black coffee and 5 quiet minutes before returning to recalibrate a failing heat exchanger. The laughter reached him before the sight did. Then he saw her, knees on cold steel, shoulders straight, eyes clear and distant as if the floor were a stage. Ethan didn't look at the students filming. He looked at her expression. It wasn't fear. It was patience. That unsettled him more than anger would have. He set his coffee down. The cup made a soft click against the table. One of the boys noticed him approaching and smirked. "It's just a joke," he said lightly. "Cultural exchange." The word hung in the air like static. Ethan stepped into the circle, boots stopping inches from the spill. He took in the details the way he always did. The tremor in a hand. The way the crowd leaned inward but kept their distance. The silence waiting to see which way the wind would blow. He exhaled slowly. "Hold my beer," he said, though he hadn't ordered one in years. Then he did something no one predicted. He knelt. The steel was cold through his work pants. He scooped up a handful of the spilled stew and took a bite without breaking eye contact with the students. The laughter died first. Then the phones lowered. The joke dissolved because it had lost its target. Lyra looked at him then, truly looked at him, and for the first time since arriving on Earth, the variable she had been measuring shifted. Across the ceiling, a small observation lens adjusted its focus by 3 millimeters. Somewhere far beyond the academy walls, data began to stream. For a long 3 seconds no one moved. The ventilation hummed overhead at a steady 60 decibels, and somewhere a tray slid across metal with a scraping whisper, but the circle around them loosened as if gravity itself had shifted. Ethan swallowed, brushed his hand against his work pants, and reached for a stack of napkins from the nearest table. He did not rush. He did not glare. He simply began wiping the floor clean. The cameras lowered one by one. The boy who had called it a joke forced a laugh that sounded thinner now. "You did not have to do that," Lyra said quietly, her voice smooth, controlled, almost analytical. Up close, her silver-blue skin reflected the fluorescent lights in faint gradients like dawn over water. Ethan glanced at her without standing. "Yeah," he replied evenly. "I did." He handed her a napkin, not as a command, not as pity, but as partnership. She accepted it after a fraction of hesitation and rose to her feet in a single fluid motion. She was nearly 6 feet tall, posture straight, chin level. There was no gratitude in her expression, only assessment. Around them, students began to disperse, shoes scuffing against steel, conversations restarting in uneasy murmurs. Someone muttered that it had gone too far. Someone else claimed it had been harmless. Ethan picked up the empty tray and set it back on the serving counter where it belonged. The cafeteria manager stared at him, unsure whether to intervene or pretend nothing had happened. Order returned not with authority, but with embarrassment. Lyra studied Ethan the way a scientist might study an unexpected variable. "You reduced your status deliberately," she said. "In my culture that would be considered a loss of dominance." Ethan shrugged and reached for his coffee, now lukewarm. "Good thing I am not from your culture." He took a slow sip. "Where I am from, standing alone is the real loss." The words settled between them heavier than the tray had. Lyra's eyes shifted slightly, not softer, but deeper, as if recalibrating. High above, the small observation lens adjusted focus again, capturing microexpressions, heart rate changes, posture alignment. Data streamed silently through encrypted channels measured in milliseconds and light years. Ethan felt none of it. He only noticed that her hands had stopped trembling, if they had ever been trembling at all. They expected you to respond with aggression, Lyra said. Most species would. Ethan let out a quiet breath through his nose. Most species are wrong sometimes. He picked up his toolbox from the edge of the circle and nodded toward the exit. You good? It was not a grand question. It was ordinary, almost casual, and somehow that unsettled her more than the spectacle had. She hesitated for the first time. I am recalibrating, she answered truthfully. Ethan gave a small half-smile. Welcome to Earth. As he walked back toward the maintenance corridor, boots echoing against the steel floor, the cafeteria lights flickered once and stabilized. Behind the walls, a remote signal spiked, and far beyond the academy, a council chamber received its first conclusion. The test had only just begun. The maintenance corridor was 12 degrees cooler than the cafeteria, the air carrying the metallic scent of coolant and ozone as Ethan stepped inside and let the heavy door seal shut behind him with a low hydraulic sigh. Fluorescent strips buzzed overhead in steady intervals, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. He set his toolbox down beside the open heat exchanger panel and stared at the blinking diagnostic lights without really seeing them. Green meant stable. Yellow meant attention required. Red meant failure. He had always appreciated systems that told the truth without emotion. Behind him, soft footsteps approached, lighter than human, measured. He did not turn immediately. You followed me, he said calmly. Yes, Lyra answered. Her voice echoed faintly against the narrow walls. I am attempting to understand the decision tree that led to your action. Ethan crouched and tightened a valve with deliberate pressure, the wrench clicking once before he released it. Sometimes there is no tree, he said. Sometimes you just know. Lyra stepped closer, studying the panel as if it were a living thing. Your species is documented as competitive, territorial, and historically violent, she said without accusation. Yet you lowered yourself publicly for an individual outside your genetic group. Ethan wiped his hands on a clean cloth and finally looked at her fully under the harsh corridor lights. Up close, her skin held faint luminescent patterns that shifted almost imperceptibly, like constellations adjusting in slow motion. You make it sound complicated, he replied. It is not. He gestured back toward the cafeteria with a tilt of his head. Nobody deserves to be alone like that. Lyra's gaze sharpened. Alone is efficient, she said. Isolation prevents escalation. Ethan gave a short breath that might have been a laugh. Isolation also tells everyone watching that cruelty is normal. The word hung in the cool air between them. For a moment, neither spoke. The heat exchanger hummed steadily, circulating warmth through pipes that ran hundreds of feet beneath the academy floors. Ethan adjusted the flow rate by 0.5 degree Fahrenheit and closed the panel with a firm click. You did not display anger, Lyra observed quietly. That was unexpected. Ethan shrugged. Anger makes it about me. That was not about me. She processed that in silence, eyes narrowing slightly as if reading data only she could see. In a chamber far beyond Earth's orbit, biometric feeds confirmed the stability of his pulse, the absence of adrenaline spikes, the measured cadence of his breathing. Variables recalculated. Probability models shifted by fractions of a percent that would alter negotiations across star systems. Lyra took one slow step back. Your action disrupted the intended outcome, she said. Good, Ethan answered simply. He lifted his toolbox and moved past her toward the stairwell, boots striking concrete in even rhythm. At the doorway he paused, not turning around. You do not have to analyze everything, he said. Sometimes you just stand up. The corridor lights reflected in her silver-blue eyes as she watched him leave, and for the first time since initiating the assessment protocol, uncertainty entered her data set. It did not feel like weakness. It felt like gravity shifting direction. By late afternoon, the academy had returned to its polished rhythm, footsteps measured, conversations restrained, sunlight angling through 40-foot glass panels that filtered the sky into soft bands of blue and white. Ethan was on a ladder near the central atrium, recalibrating. A ceiling vent that insisted on drifting 2 degrees off target every hour. The building breathed around him in steady mechanical sighs. Below, students crossed the marble floor in quiet clusters, their reflections gliding beneath them like second thoughts. He heard her before he saw her. Not footsteps. Silence. Lyra stopped at the base of the ladder and looked up without speaking. From that height, he could see the faint shimmer across her skin, patterns that brightened slightly in natural light. Is the system stable? She asked, voice level. Ethan tightened the final screw and climbed down, boots landing with a soft thud. Stable enough, he said. Everything drifts a little. You just correct it. She considered that as if it were a cultural principle rather than a maintenance note. Around them, whispers lingered. The cafeteria footage had circulated in private channels, clipped, analyzed, replayed. No one confronted him. No one confronted her. But the space between them and the rest of the room carried a new tension, like static before a storm that refused to break. Your intervention altered peer dynamics by 12%, Lyra said quietly. Social clusters are reorganizing. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You measured that? Yes. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. This institution was selected because it reflects your species under low supervision. Stress reveals truth. He studied her expression carefully. There was no malice there, only precision. So this is all a lab to you, he said, not accusing, just clarifying. Lyra's eyes shifted, silver flecks catching the light. It was. The word felt heavier than the marble beneath their feet. A group of students passed, glancing at them with something that looked less like amusement now and more like uncertainty. Influence did not always require force. Sometimes it required contrast. Ethan leaned against the ladder, arms folded loosely. And now, he asked. Lyra hesitated. That, more than anything, caught his attention. Now the variables are not aligning with projection, she admitted. Your action introduced an unpredicted constant. He gave a small breath that almost formed a laugh. I am not a constant. I am just a guy fixing vents. You are a signal, she corrected softly. High above the atrium, concealed within the architectural beams, a microtransmitter adjusted its frequency. Data flowed in silent streams measured in gigabytes per second, crossing distances counted in light years. In a distant chamber, observers recalculated risk, assessments, and alliance probabilities. Back in the atrium, a bell chimed the end of the academic block, its tone resonating through polished stone. Lyra looked at Ethan not as a subject now, but as a choice. There will be a formal review, she said. Your behavior will be evaluated. Ethan nodded once. Figures. He picked up his toolbox and started toward the service corridor. After a step he paused. If they ask, tell them the truth. Lyra watched him walk away through shafts of late afternoon light, and for the first time the test parameters felt less like control and more like consequence. Somewhere beyond Earth's orbit, a council chamber dimmed its lights as new data illuminated a possibility none of them had fully calculated. Humanity might not need supervision. It might need partnership. The formal review notice arrived at 6:12 p.m., printed on thick academy letterhead, and slid under Ethan's maintenance office door with quiet precision. He found it when he returned from checking the rooftop solar arrays, the sky outside fading into a deep orange that reflected against the glass towers downtown. The paper felt heavier than it needed to be. Requested appearance. Administrative board. Conduct evaluation. He read it once, then set it on the metal desk beside a half-empty thermos of coffee gone cold. The room smelled faintly of dust and machine oil, steady and familiar. Across campus, Lyra stood alone in the observation lounge on the 32nd floor, looking out over the city lights flickering on one by one like grounded stars. Her reflection hovered in the glass, silver blue against the darkening sky. Behind the walls, concealed transmitters pulsed softly, sending compressed streams of data beyond Earth's orbit. In a chamber measured not in feet, but in astronomical units, members of the Vaith Council observed the Academy through filtered feeds. Emotional variance charts glowed in translucent layers. Human behavioral clusters shifted in subtle arcs. One name remained highlighted. Ethan Cole. He is statistically insignificant in rank, one counselor noted. Maintenance class. Limited authority. Lyra did not turn from the window when she responded through the private channel embedded in her wrist cuff. Authority is not the relevant metric, she said calmly. Influence is. In his office, Ethan loosened the collar of his work shirt and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling fan that rotated at a steady 70 revolutions per minute. He was not angry. He was not worried. He was tired in the quiet way that came from standing up when it would have been easier to stay seated. A soft knock interrupted the mechanical rhythm. He rose and opened the door. Lyra stood there, posture straight, eyes steady. "You received the notice," she said. "Yes." He stepped aside so she could enter. The office was small, barely 12 by 12 feet, walls lined with tool racks and maintenance schematics pinned in neat rows. She glanced at the diagrams, at the measured lines and labeled systems. "You maintain structures that others rely on without acknowledgement," she observed. "That is the job," he replied. Silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, just dense. "The review will determine whether your behavior aligns with institutional standards," she said carefully. Ethan gave a faint smile. If protecting someone does not align with their standards, then maybe their standards need maintenance. The metaphor hung in the air like a recalibrated setting. Lyra's luminescent patterns shifted slightly, brighter along her forearms. Somewhere beyond Earth's atmosphere, probability models recalculated once more, adjusting alliance projections by measurable margins. "There are consequences," she warned quietly. Ethan picked up the notice and folded it once, precise and even. "There always are." He looked at her then, not as a subject under study, but as someone standing at the edge of a decision. The question is what kind. Outside, the city lights steadied into a constant glow, and far above them, hidden in orbit, a silent vessel altered its trajectory by a fraction of a degree, as if preparing for a future it had not expected to need. The review was scheduled for 9 o'clock the next morning in Conference Room B, a space designed to feel neutral and instead feeling surgical. All glass walls and polished stone, temperature fixed at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, as if comfort could be standardized. Ethan arrived 5 minutes early, work boots clean, shirt pressed, as well as a maintenance uniform ever could be. He did not bring a lawyer. He did not bring a speech. He carried only a folded notice in his back pocket and the quiet steadiness that had followed him since the cafeteria. Outside the room, students slowed their steps as they passed, curiosity flickering across their faces before they looked away. Inside, 3 administrators sat behind a curved table, tablets glowing softly in front of them. Lyra stood near the far wall, hands clasped behind her back, posture formal in a way that did not match the role of an ordinary exchange student. Ethan noticed that immediately. The door sealed with a muted click. "Mr. Cole," the chairwoman began, voice smooth. "Your conduct has raised concerns regarding professional boundaries." Ethan nodded once. Understood. No defensiveness. No apology. Just acknowledgement. A screen illuminated behind them, displaying cafeteria footage frozen at the moment he knelt on the steel floor. The image held the room in a suspended breath. "You disrupted a student interaction," another administrator said. "You escalated visibility." Ethan glanced at the screen, then back to the panel. "I reduced isolation," he answered evenly. The words landed with quiet weight. Across the table, biometric readings from concealed sensors registered stable pulse, controlled respiration, no measurable hostility. Lyra watched the data stream across her internal display, numbers aligning with the anomaly she had reported. The chairwoman folded her hands. "Did you consider the institutional consequences?" she asked. Ethan thought for a second, not searching for the right answer, only the honest one. "Yes," he said. "I decided they were secondary." Silence followed, thick but not hostile. Outside the academy, in orbit beyond visible range, the Vaith vessel adjusted its listening array by a fraction of an inch, sharpening signal clarity by less than 1%. In the council chamber light years away, figures observed without blinking, their projections recalculating diplomatic risk in real time. "Why?" the final administrator asked. It was not procedural anymore. It was personal. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, boots pressing against the stone floor. "Because if everyone calculates first, nobody acts," he said. "And then the worst behavior sets the standard." The room grew still. Lyra felt something unfamiliar ripple through her, not uncertainty this time, but recognition. The administrators exchanged glances that carried more humanity than policy. The chairwoman inhaled slowly. "This academy promotes interspecies understanding," she said. "Your method was unconventional." Ethan gave a faint, almost tired smile. Understanding is not always comfortable. The screen behind them went dark. For a moment, the only sound was the quiet hum of climate control and distant footsteps in the hall. In orbit, probability models shifted again, this time crossing a threshold none of the observers had predicted so early. The review was no longer about discipline. It was about definition. And for the first time since the test began, the council understood that humanity might not be measured by compliance, but by choice. The decision did not come immediately. The administrators asked Ethan to wait outside while they reviewed final notes, their voices lowering once the door sealed shut. The hallway felt longer than before, 20 yards of polished stone and framed mission statements about unity and cooperation. Ethan stood with his hands resting loosely at his sides, eyes on a distant window where morning sunlight spilled across the campus lawn in clean, golden lines. He did not pace. He did not check his phone. He simply waited. Lyra stepped out a minute later, the door sliding closed behind her with a muted hiss. Her expression was composed, but the faint luminescent patterns along her forearms were brighter than usual, like distant lightning behind clouds. "The council is observing this proceeding in real time," she said quietly. Ethan tilted his head slightly. "Your council," he replied. It was not a question. "Yes," she confirmed. "This academy was selected as a live behavioral assessment site. I was placed here to evaluate humanity's response to controlled social stress." The words hung between them, precise and unadorned. Ethan absorbed them without visible shock. "So the cafeteria," he said slowly. "A variable injection," Lyra answered. "Designed to measure reflexive ethics." He let out a slow breath, eyes returning to the sunlight on the lawn. "And," she stepped closer, lowering her voice, "you were not the predicted outcome." In orbit above Earth, the concealed Vaith vessel powered down its passive cloaking field by a fraction of a percent, sensors aligning more directly with the Academy's communication grid. Across light years, council members leaned forward as biometric overlays filled their chamber with shifting holographic graphs. Human heart rate variability, cortisol absence, pattern recognition deviation, threshold exceeded. Back in the hallway, the door opened again. The chairwoman motioned them inside. The room felt different now, less clinical, more uncertain. "Mr. Cole," she began. "After reviewing the context and the broader implications, the board has determined that no disciplinary action will be taken." Ethan nodded once. "All right." He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He only accepted the outcome with the same steadiness he had carried from the start. The chairwoman hesitated before continuing. "However, there has been an external inquiry regarding your conduct, one beyond this institution." Ethan glanced briefly at Lyra. She met his gaze without flinching. "Clarify," he said calmly. The screen behind them flickered to life, not with cafeteria footage this time, but with an unfamiliar emblem composed of interlocking silver arcs surrounding a distant star. The temperature in the room seemed to drop a single degree. "Humanity is under evaluation," Lyra said softly. "And you have just altered the trajectory of that evaluation." Silence filled the space, thick and electric. Ethan studied the emblem, then looked back at her. "I fixed a vent," he said evenly. "And I refuse to let someone stand alone." Lyra's voice carried a note that was almost reverent. "Exactly." Far above the planet, the Vaith vessel shifted its orbit by a measurable margin, no longer positioned as an observer preparing to withdraw, but as a delegate preparing to descend. The test had reached its inflection point, and humanity's defining trait had not been dominance or strategy. It had been choice. The emblem on the screen rotated slowly, silver arcs orbiting a distant star that pulsed with soft white light, and for a moment the room felt smaller than its measured 20 by 30 feet, as if the walls themselves understood they were no longer containing a local conversation. Ethan stood with his boots planted firmly on polished stone, hands relaxed at his sides, gaze steady on the symbol that represented a civilization light years beyond his morning routine. "You are saying this was never just about a cafeteria?" he said quietly. Lyra stepped forward into the glow of the display, her silver blue skin reflecting the emblem in fractured light. "It was about reflex," she replied. "About what your species does when no reward is guaranteed and no punishment is certain." The administrators remained seated, silent now, aware that the scale of the discussion had shifted beyond policy and into history. Above Earth's atmosphere, the Vaith vessel powered its descent thrusters for the first time since entering orbit, a controlled burn measured in precise pounds of force, altering its trajectory toward the planet's daylight hemisphere. In the distant council chamber, projections filled the air, simulations branching into thousands of possible futures. Conflict scenarios dimmed. Cooperative models brightened. One counselor spoke through the transmission channel, voice resonant and calm. Subject Ethan Cole demonstrated non-strategic altruism under observation. The translation rendered. Probability of exploitative. Intent remains below measurable threshold. Ethan heard none of that directly. Only Lyra's steady voice as she continued. My presence here was to determine whether humanity responds primarily to dominance or to dignity, she said. Your action answered that. He shifted his weight slightly, absorbing the gravity of her words without theatrics. I did not answer for humanity, he said. I answered for myself. Lyra's eyes softened, though her posture remained formal. That distinction is precisely what altered the outcome. The chairwoman finally found her voice. What happens now? She asked. Lyra turned toward her, and for the first time there was no concealment in her tone. Now the Vaith Council must decide whether to approach Earth as supervisors, she said, pausing just long enough for the word to settle, or as equals. Outside the academy windows, a faint streak crossed the morning sky, too high and too fast for most to notice, a controlled descent hidden within atmospheric glare. Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment settling not as fear, but as clarity. If they are coming, he said evenly, tell them they do not need to test every room. Sometimes the answer is simple. Lyra studied him, the luminescent patterns along her skin aligning into calm symmetry. Simplicity, she said, almost to herself. Your species disguises complexity within it. In orbit's thinning edge, the vessel completed its adjustment, no longer a distant observer, but a declared presence preparing contact protocols. And in that quiet conference room, beneath fluorescent lights calibrated to 70 degrees and steady, humanity's future shifted not because of power, but because one man had chosen not to look away. The sky above the academy brightened with a shimmer that did not belong to weather, a silent distortion stretching across blue like heat rising from asphalt. And within seconds, every phone on campus tilted upward as a sleek silver vessel resolved from invisibility, descending with controlled precision until it hovered 500 feet above the main lawn. There was no explosion of sound, only a low harmonic resonance that vibrated gently through glass and bone, a frequency calibrated not to intimidate, but to announce. Students gathered in widening circles, sunlight reflecting off the craft's curved hull in liquid arcs. Inside Conference Room B, the emblem on the screen faded as a live feed replaced it, showing the vessel steady against the morning sky. Ethan stepped closer to the window, hands resting loosely at his sides, eyes steady. They do not do subtle, he murmured. Lyra stood beside him, posture no longer that of a hidden observer, but of a representative. The luminescent patterns along her skin aligned into formal symmetry, faint lines tracing across her arms like ceremonial markings. This is restraint, she said quietly. You should see what force looks like. The administrators remained silent, history unfolding beyond their jurisdiction. A narrow beam of white light extended from the vessel to the center of the lawn, not a weapon, not a threat, but a corridor. Within it, 3 tall figures materialized gradually, forms resolving from brilliance into detail, their features refined, eyes reflective like polished metal. They did not advance. They waited. Across the planet, satellites recalibrated. Governments scrambled for data. Yet on the lawn of a cultural academy, the first contact protocol hinged on a man in work boots and a woman whose presence had once been a test. Lyra turned to Ethan. The council requests that you stand with me, she said. He blinked once. I fix vents, he replied evenly. Today you fix perception, she answered. He studied her for a long second, then nodded. Together they walked through the atrium, past rows of silent students, through doors that opened automatically, as if even the building understood the weight of the moment. The grass felt soft under Ethan's boots as they stepped into sunlight. The harmonic resonance deepened slightly, responding to proximity. The 3 Vaith delegates inclined their heads in synchronized acknowledgement. Lyra spoke first, her voice carrying clearly across the lawn without amplification. Humanity has been observed, she declared. It has chosen dignity without incentive. A faint shift rippled through the gathered crowd, confusion giving way to awe. Ethan felt every eye on him, yet his pulse remained steady. He did not raise his voice. He did not deliver a speech crafted for history. He simply stood there, shoulders square, gaze level. One of the delegates stepped forward a single pace. Ethan Cole. The translated voice resonated, calm and precise. Your action recalibrated our assessment. We come not as supervisors, but as partners. A breeze moved across the lawn, carrying the scent of cut grass and warm sunlight. Ethan glanced at Lyra, who met his eyes with something no longer analytical but human in its warmth. Guess that means you are staying, he said softly. Yes, she replied. Above them, the vessel adjusted its hover by inches, stabilizing. No applause broke the silence. No anthem played. Only a quiet understanding settled over the campus like a second atmosphere. In a universe that measured power in fleets and fire, the future had shifted because one man chose not to let someone kneel alone, and the stars, for once, answered in kind.